This is Coding Guideline 1C18G, and it's found in ICD-10-CM Chapter 18. It is SIRS due to non-infectious process. So systemic inflammatory response syndrome, or SIRS, is something that can develop as a result of certain non-infectious disease processes. And these might include trauma, malignant neoplasm, pancreatitis. When SIRS is documented with a non-infectious condition, and no subsequent infection is documented, the code for that underlying condition, such as the injury, or trauma, malignant neoplasm, pancreatitis, that should be assigned, followed by code R65.10, Systemic Inflammatory Response Syndrome, SIRS, of non-infectious origin without acute organ dysfunction. Or code R6511, Systemic Inflammatory Response Syndrome, SIRS, of non-infectious origin with acute organ dysfunction. And if an associated acute organ dysfunction is documented, the appropriate code for the specific type of organ dysfunction or dysfunctions should be assigned in addition to code R65.11. So you'd have to use an additional code, for example, if there was acute kidney failure or acute respiratory failure. If the acute organ dysfunction is documented, but it cannot be determined if the acute organ dysfunction is associated with SIRS or due to another condition, that is directly due to the trauma, the provider should be queried. So this coding guideline is very dense, but we're going to break it down in our next scenario. Before we get there, though, let's take a look at these codes at R65.11 and 10 and 11. So to get there, you would put in syndrome and then systemic inflammatory response, SIRS, of non-infectious origin. So you see the default is without the organ dysfunction, and that's R6510. And if you say it's with acute organ dysfunction, you'll go to R6511. So over here in the tabular, and you're reminded for any codes that begin with R65.1, you're to code first the underlying condition. And this is what we just read in the guideline. So R6510 is SIRS of non-infectious origin without acute organ dysfunction. And R6511 is SIRS of non-infectious origin with acute organ dysfunction. Again, here, the reminder is to use an additional code in this case for the particular kind of organ dysfunction, and it gives you some examples. So let's see how we can apply Coding Guideline 1C18G in a clinical scenario. Here we have a 14-year-old female who presents to the ED with fever, tachycardia, and tachypnea. She is diagnosed with heat stroke and SIRS. All right, so the first thing we need to do is code the condition, and the condition is heat stroke. And so when we path stroke heat, we come up with T67.0, and we go to the tabular. It says heat stroke and sunstroke, and we know that we're going to need additional characters, so we check what would be appropriate, and this is the initial encounter, so we know we need an A for our 7th character. Now, since T67.0 is only 4 characters, we need a couple of placeholders for the 5th and 6th position. So we come up with T67.0 XXA. Now, we need to code the SIRS. So in order to do that, we say syndrome, systemic inflammatory response, SIRS, of non-infectious origin. And we see R65.10 would be the appropriate code. So we go to the tabular, we confirm that here, and there are no additional characters needed. We also are reminded here that the sequencing is important, as we are to code first the underlying conditions, such as, and it even mentions heat stroke. So we have the correct sequencing, and we have the correct codes, and that's all we need for Coding Guideline 1C18G.